Yes.
Thank you. In this third and final part of the presentation, we're going to just be looking at the HTLV-3 look back. We are, of course, going back in time from where we were in relation to hepatitis B. Initially, we can see that HTLV-3 look-back work was undertaken much the same way as for post-transfusion jaundice. If we can have DHSC 306923 _ 071, please, Shumik. We have a letter from a draft letter from Dr. Gunson to Dr. Galbraith dated the 3rd of April 1984, which says the regional transfusion centres already have systems available for the follow-up of donors who are implicated in patients who develop transfusion-associated hepatitis. I do not see that fundamentally the proposal to follow up donors implicated in patients who develop AIDS or the follow-up of donations given by persons who subsequently develop AIDS is significantly different. From this point of view, therefore, I'm sure you would have full cooperation of the regional transfusion directors in this matter. The next day, from that draft letter, there appears to have been a meeting between Dr. Galbraith, Dr. Gunson and Dr. McAvoy. That's on the 4th of April 1984. If we could have CBLA 301833, please. Here we have a note of the meeting setting out a process that was to be followed. Point 1, CDSC will inform the appropriate RTD when a patient is diagnosed with AIDS. If the patient admits to donating blood, contact will be by telephone. Investigation will be undertaken to find out whether the person is registered as a donor. If the answer is no, CDSC will be informed. If the answer is yes, further action will be trace the fate of blood donations with respect to all products given during the previous 5 years. If plasma has been sent to BPL for fractionation, Dr. R.S. Lane will be informed as soon as possible. The appropriate hospitals should be asked to identify the patients who received the blood products, provide any information they have on the subsequent progress of the patients, and the name of the patient's family doctors. Subsequent to consultation with the defence organisations, a communication will be sent to the family doctor informing him of the circumstances and a copy of the letter sent to CDSC, who will carry out any further follow-up. We're going to pick up that point in a moment, sir, so if we just hold that in our minds. The process then continues. CDSC should be kept informed of progress. And then a reverse look-back situation is addressed in part 2. CDSC will inform the appropriate RTD when a patient is diagnosed with AIDS who has stated that he or she has received a transfusion of blood and/or blood products. If the patient has received blood products derived from pooled plasma, which may involve a large number of donors, Dr. McAvoy will discuss with the RTD the practicalities of follow-up within the resources available. If the patient is a haemophiliac, Dr. Krask, consultant virologist, PHLS, Manchester, will also be involved. If the patient has received NHS products derived from pooled plasma, Dr. Lane will be informed. If the patient has received blood products which have been prepared and issued from the RTC, the following action will be taken. Identification of the donor from whose blood the products were prepared. Again, after consideration of the practicalities of the situation, with respect to the particular case in discussion with Dr. McAvoy, it may be necessary to recall the donors for A, interview and medical examination, B, collection of blood sample to carry out non-specific tests. Where this is done and by whom will be at the discretion of the RTD. If none of the donors involved fall into high-risk groups for AIDS, CDSC will be informed. If any donor is suspected of having AIDS, then referral should be made for further medical examination and an investigation carried out with respect to previous donations as detailed in paragraph 1.3 above. The point I flagged just a moment ago, 1.3.4, the subsequent consultation with the defence organisations, communication will be sent to the family doctor. That issue was raised again at a meeting of the regional transfusion directors on the 11th of July 1980.
Just before we leave that last page, can we just go back to the second page? It's little b at the top of the page, 2.2b, collection of blood samples. So this is from a suspected donor.
Yes.
And the suggestion is there may be a collection of blood sample to carry out non-specific tests. So one wonders whether the implication of that might be that the donor isn't told what the tests are for.
It's not something I can address.
No, it's without there being specific evidence on it. It's if what people are looking for here is HTLV3 or indicators, this being what April 84, indicators that there may be T-cell abnormalities. Difficult to know why it should be non-specific.
Well, so it might be non-specific in the sense that the donor isn't told, or it might be non-specific in that it's general tests, that there isn't a specific test they're recommending.
Yes, so it's not anyone speculating that means that there was a recommendation to carry out tests pulling the wool over the eyes of the donor is actually reading too much into it.
One simply doesn't know, sir.
Yes, thank you.
In terms of the reference to the defence organisations and a letter going to the family doctor, we pick that up at the Regional Transfusion Directors meeting of the 11th of July 1984. DHSC 302245_002. And it's the second page of these minutes. Under the heading AIDS, Dr. Gunson had approached the Medical Defence Union. Their reply was that an adequate precaution if a patient has been given at-risk blood was that the general practitioner should be informed in confidence. Previous experience with cases of venereal disease in donors led some members to doubt this procedure. It's possible that a DHSS working group will be set up and legal implications could be considered. We can then turn to the first meeting of the Advisory Committee of the NSBT Working Group on AIDS, and we're going to look at a memo recording what happened at that meeting. The memo is dated the 27th of November 1984. It's DHSC 302251_011, please. The memo is written by a M.E. Abrams from Med SEB to a Dr. Harris, simply noting what the committee had discussed. And under Roman numeral 6, it was noted that donors should be told that HTLV3 testing will be added to the other tests done. We're now in November 1984. Donors with positive tests should be told the answer, although no unanimity on who should do it or how. Follow-up of such donors and patients and counselling and contact tracing arrangements, etc., are being considered by IMCD. There are very difficult and complex issues to be taken on board. One suggestion was a regional immunology service to deal with all this at special centres. And we then see much more formalised processes becoming a part of the discussions within the meetings about screening of blood donations. So if we go on to a meeting of the Regional Transfusion Directors dated the 10th of July 1985, CBLA 302212, We can see at the top of the document the date, and then if we go over to the third page, under the heading of AIDS, there was a report on a number of meetings. It was felt not essential to have the GP's name in all instances, but that all donors must be informed that testing will be carried out, and there's discussion of a leaflet. Obviously, HTLV3 positive donations would be destroyed. The initial approach to such a donor would be from the MBTS, and afterwards counselling would be essential. We look to the expert advisory group for guidelines, but GPs would be involved with the donor's consent. Then if we go over the page, it was agreed that follow-up of previous donations of plasma should be for 3 to 5 years. The chairman requested the approval of the meeting to let the group draft a flow diagram for AIDS testing and following up of donations. The meeting tomorrow will, if given approval, pass on recommendations to the Expert Advisory Committee and save considerable time. So this July 1985 meeting is the point at which a much more structured discussion is starting in relation to following up of donations. And we see then the meeting of the working party the next day, there was a discussion about look back. DHSC 40406. And it's internal page 4, please. Under point 7, headed follow-up of recipients of previous donations given by donors found to be HTLV3 positive. Efforts will be made to determine the names of any patients who received blood and components from the donations taken during the past 5 years, and the information regarding the known or possible seropositivity of the donation given to the consultant in charge of the patient. If plasma from any of the donations was sent for fractionation, full follow-up of all patients receiving coagulation factor concentrates may be difficult or impossible. Since patients suffering from haemophilia A and B are being investigated for anti-HTLV3 at present, it's recommended that no additional follow-up be carried out. That position was modified slightly by the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS on the 30th of July 1985. PRSE 302628, please. And it's internal page 5, please. Oh, sorry, before we go there, we can see that the meeting was the 30th of July 1985, and then internal page 5. Under the heading 7.4.3, follow-up of blood donations previously given by donors who are identified as positive for HTLV3. X said that the screening subcommittee had recommended that the haematologist in charge of the hospital blood bank should be informed if it was believed that an earlier donation could have transmitted HTLV3 infection. The haematologist would be asked to identify the recipient of the suspect donation and to inform the clinician in charge of the case when the blood had been transfused. The BTS was aware of the importance of good record keeping to enable the follow-up of donations. It was suggested that these follow-up investigations would provide a good opportunity to check on the transmission of the virus between spouses and from female to male, and the national registry would be useful. Members agreed with the subcommittee's recommendations and considered that it would be up to the clinician in charge of the patient to decide on what subsequent investigations should be made. It was also agreed that although there might be practical difficulties, the follow-up for donations should go back a minimum of 5 years from the date of the donation. from the evidence that was given to the Penrose inquiry, it appears that the 5-year rule was also used in Scotland, and we've seen nothing that suggests that that's not the position. We've had statements from the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service, the Welsh Service and the Scottish Service. All of those indicate that the 4 nations operated the HTLV3 look-back procedure together, and it was a more centralised and structured process than the earlier hepatitis look-backs. And so it was a 4 nations process.
This is a 5-year from the date of donation.
Yes.
So if one's looking at a blood product, it may be as much as 7 years ago.
It could be, indeed. Although you'll note the difficulties highlighted in the earlier document in relation to blood products and whether that was in fact feasible or not.
So probably this is relating to transfusion as such.
I think that would be a fair reading of the document, sir. It's certainly a conclusion you could reach. It is clear, however, that there was an issue about donors who self-excluded from donating and wouldn't then become known to the blood services subsequently. Dr. Hewitt has raised this point in her witness statement, and I'm sure we will explore that at a later point. But I raise it now simply so that I can take you, sir, to the minutes of a meeting of the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS of the 26th of November 1985. The document is DHSC 301736. So it's the 26th of November 1985, and if we turn to the final page, page 12, under the agenda item 16, any other business, we see Dr. Tedder, on behalf of Dr. Contreras, asked clinical members whether they would consider asking seropositive patients as a matter of routine if they had donated blood since 1978, and where blood had been donated, if they would refer their patients to the regional transfusion centre in order that recipients of donations could be followed up. And so we see him asking, and it appears that at that stage, it being unresolved, whether those who were identified as being HTLV3 positive should be asked about having given blood so that a look-back process could be followed in relation to them as well. We have identified a number of examples of the notification process and the look-back process operating as expected from those meeting minutes. But I want to just look at one particular example now, CBLA 5010_209, please. It's a letter from October 84 from the Deputy Medical Director of the Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre to Dr. Snape to confirm Dr. Smith's and my own telephone calls to you within the last day or two. We've been informed that one of our male donors has been admitted into a Bournemouth hospital. The clinical diagnosis is almost certainly AIDS. And then he gives the details of his previous known donations. And we can see that the first one, donation not used, time expired plasma pooled and sent to BPL. The second, whole blood donation sent to one of our Portsmouth hospitals and not returned. Third, FFP sent to BPL, giving the batch and pack number. Plasma reduced blood sent to one of our Portsmouth hospitals and not returned. And then fourth, plasma separated and frozen. That this was a very recent donation. And it indicates at the end of the letter, regarding donations 2 and 3, we're not getting in touch with the clinicians involved until the diagnosis is confirmed. but the indication is that they have, or one might read the letter as suggesting they've identified who the clinicians for those patients are, and once, if the diagnosis is confirmed, then they would be getting in touch with the clinician. This is then picked up in a further subsequent report. Apologies, so if I can just take a moment. Yes, a fuller report of the incident was prepared in October, later in October 1984, DHSC 301111. And if we can start at page 2, please. Yes. We see on this page a note of the donor condition and the products affected, but if we then go on to the second page, the next page, the third page of this document, we see under the heading 2, actions to secure / recall implicated products. And we see that Dr. Smith of Wessex was informed of the implication of the batch and was asked to recall all vials, including any held by patients for home therapy. Dr. Napier was unavailable, but Mr. Booth was informed and was asked to recall all vials, including home therapy issues. Both telephone conversations were confirmed in writing. It goes on to explain that various batches were then held pending investigation. And then on the next page, we have a record of the results of the Factor VIII recall, and we can see that 400 vials were dispatched to Cardiff, broken down in that way. 150 were held at the RTC. In relation to Heath Park, 101 out of 150 were recovered. Morriston, 51 out of 60 were recovered. Carmarthen, 36 out of 40. So a total of 338 vials was recovered. 9 patients received the batch. And we get similar information in relation to Wessex. We then have a note under follow-up actions. Dr. Smith was asked to report any plasma from this donor dispatched to BPL or PFL within the last 5 years. Dr. Smith was also asked to determine whether the donor had a history of attendance at local special clinics for venereal disease. And then finally, there are, on the last page, observations on the incident. And there's just one paragraph that I think is worth highlighting here, and that's paragraph 5.3. The appearance of this donor at 3 different centres within 2 years clearly underlines a fundamental problem when carrying out follow-up of donor incidents of this sort. Surely central coordination of donor records is unavoidable, and that's the view of Dr. Snape. Before we leave that document, I just want to highlight the second page with the heading of the report so that the next document makes sense. It's noted that it's a summary report on the recall of the batch HL3186. And we see this picked up again in the document CBLA 5010_202. And this is a letter in 1988 from Dr. Crask to Dr. Lane, dealing with batch HL3186. In the second paragraph, the follow-up we were doing 18 months ago of this incident was bedevilled at that time by the reluctance of haemophilia centre directors to cause what they considered to be an unnecessary worry to their patients, so that a follow-up of the recipients who received this product hasn't been carried out in the formal sense. There then was reference to a paper that had been published, and Dr. Lane's letter had prompted Dr. Krask to reopen the inquiry. Unfortunately, at this point, we have not been able to trace that letter from Dr. Lane. Efforts are ongoing. But in the fourth paragraph of this letter, Dr. Krask says, "Your letter prompts me to reopen this inquiry, as we don't know the outcome of patients who received this and other batches which may have been contaminated with HIV. I'll consult my files and let you have a report as to what's known at the present time." The point raised by Dr. Krask in relation to the Haemophilia Centre directors is a point that's raised also by Dr. Rejman in 1992. He had prepared a memo to Mr. Canavan. It's a memo dated the 6th of February 1992, DHSC 302585_004. We can see we can see on the second page of the memo that the context of it is about financial assistance, but it's and we can see that in paragraph 7. But the paragraph I want to draw to your attention is paragraph 4 on the first page, which notes that I think it's important to remember what happened to the original look-back pilot suggested by EAGA. There was considerable resistance from some consultants to inform recipients who might be at risk of HIV, and various reasons were put forward for this, including 1, not being of any benefit to a patient who is likely to die from his primary disease in the near future, and 2, the distress that could be caused to a patient or his family of knowing that he was infected with HIV when he was actually dying of another disease. There was also opposition from some local ethical committees on similar grounds. It's possible that the prospect of financial gain may make look-back easier on this occasion. So it's noting in this context, in relation to blood transfusion and tissue recipients, that Dr. Regiman's understanding at that time was there had been resistance in relation to informing recipients of their risk of HIV. The question of the reluctance of clinicians is also highlighted in 2 further documents. One of which is more contemporaneous. It's December 1985 from a consultant let me start again. It's a letter from 1985 between 2 consultant haematologists, which gives us some indication of at least what one person's view was, in addition to what we've already noted. It's NHBT 00111051_010. Where it's noted that the screening process had started, and it was agreed that if any positive donor was found, their previous donations would be traced. One such donation had been highlighted to them. And in the middle of the second paragraph, haematologist indicates, I personally am not quite sure what the transfusion service hopes to achieve by this type of follow-up, but I'm told it would be helpful if you could find out who received the donation and inform the consultant in charge of the patient of this finding. I have to ask you to ensure that the recipient is not told, because the worry inflicted on the poor recipient would be out of all proportion to the possible risk. We then have a epidemiological study that was being run from 1986 from Bristol. And there are a number of documents from that epidemiological study that I want to go to now. The first is DHSC 302480_047. This is a letter from Dr. Wallington, who was running the study, to his colleague, setting out the nature of the study that was being proposed. It's a letter that went to the Regional Transfusion Centre directors, and it explained the need for further research. If we look at the end of the first page, we can see that he notes the following. Some patients will have been infected by transfusion in this country, but as yet they've not been identified. Most of these will not belong to the high-risk groups and will therefore provide an opportunity to study how this virus spreads, if at all, outside of the high-risk groups. It can also be argued that these people and their close contacts should be identified and counselled for their own sakes. As you know, it's been agreed that an attempt be made to identify and study these patients and their household contacts. He then notes that the project will be coordinated from Bristol, but is totally dependent on considerable work on the part of each regional transfusion service and other health service staff who will have to be contacted at the regional level. And he goes on towards the end of the letter to say he looks forward to receiving details of both donors and patients whose permission we have to contact. Perhaps we could start with inquiries based on the donors picked up by screening since last October 14th. There are also instances in which patients infected by blood transfusion have brought the problem to light, and a donor can be found by back tracing. The focus of the study is set out rather more clearly in a letter to Dr. Gunson in May 87. The document is NHBT 304202. And it's the first paragraph where you see him set out the point of the study. As you know, it's been agreed within the NBTS that an attempt be made to identify, help and investigate patients who've received transfusions which might have infected them with HIV, also where necessary their household contacts. And if we turn the page, he sets out in the second paragraph what he terms task 2, the yellow sheets, which are the recipient tracing and study. And he says, I've been questioned much more vigorously on the ethics of this part of the study than on donor tracing. People have been very worried about the idea of approaching blood recipients, a proportion of whom will be well and unsuspecting with such a dread diagnosis, and even more in doubt about investigation of household contacts. Opinion has been changing rapidly, and most people now believe that infected persons should be identified whenever possible for public health reasons. As this part of the study will undoubtedly prove controversial, I think colleagues in haematology should be fully informed before being presented with notification of a donation thought to be infectious. So what I would suggest this document highlights is that there clearly was an ongoing controversy about whether recipients should be informed of the risks, as we saw in earlier documents. Then what we have, sorry, sir. The next piece of correspondence that we should go to is a response from Dr. Wallington to Dr. Gunson in 1991. What appears to have happened is that concerns were raised in January 1991 by Dr. Contreras that nothing had been heard about the study despite her sending a lot of data. And what we then have is the response from Dr. Wallington in relation to that. And the document is NHBT 304810. What Dr. Wallington says in the second paragraph is, I think that Marcella, Dr. Contreras' letter, expresses a reasonable concern. I have so far received data on 84 donors on the comprehensive questionnaire that she mentions. North London and 1 or 2 other regional transfusion centres, including the Manchester Centre, have continued to send in completed forms. Certain transfusion centres have never sent them. Scotland has never participated apart from a few forms from Edinburgh. Then there's some discussion of other data gathering exercises that had taken place, and towards the end of the letter he says, I think at this stage we should abandon the study as I don't think we'll learn more from it that's not being learned from other data gathering efforts. And then the final page. As you are well aware, the look-back element of this study never got off the ground. People were simply unwilling. Exactly what they were unwilling to do, whether it was the participation in the study or undertaking some element of the look-back process, is unclear from the letters, and that's something that we will need to explore further. But it perhaps suggests that there were difficulties in there was controversy in relation to informing recipients, and there was difficulties in obtaining data from transfusion centres of exactly what was being done and who had been traced. The difficulties with look-back exercises are also exemplified in a study by Dr. Hewitt, Dr. Moore and Dr. Barbara, which was discussed at the 4th International AIDS Conference in June 1988 in Stockholm. The reference is NHBT 005 7880. We see here the objective, which was to trace past recipients who might have received blood components infectious for HIV. Donations were traced for 3 categories of donors. 1, current donors found positive for anti-HIV, 2, ex-donors reported positive, and 3, donors implicated in cases of transfusion-transmitted HIV. Hospitals were notified of involved blood components, traced their fate, and blood samples were obtained from living recipients wherever possible. Results. Previous donations had been given by 9 of 17 current donors, 4 ex-donors and 2 identified as anti-HIV positive through infected recipients. Of 44 blood components made, 6 were unused, 9 not traced by the hospital, and 4 incorporated in plasma pools for factor VIII. Of recipients who could be traced, 11 were deceased, 8 were not infected, 3 were anti-HIV positive, and 4 were not tested. 7 recipients were notified as infected. In 2 cases, donors were implicated. 2 cases could not be solved despite contact of all available donors. 1 could not be pursued due to inadequate hospital records, and 2 are incomplete. conclusions, these investigations are time-consuming. Hospital records are often deficient. The benefit produced by these inquiries has been little, but 3 blood recipients have been identified as seropositive and spread to their sexual partners, possibly averted. Now, that's obviously an extract of a conference paper that was given, but it gives us some indication of the conclusions of the work in relation to that material. We have a further report by Dr. Hewitt from 1993, DHSC 306351_032 in tab 107. DHSC 306351_032. If we start on page 1. That's okay. So we can see there the date. It was received by CDSC in July 93. And then if we go over the page, we have the abstract, which indicates the objective, which was to study the transmission of HIV by blood donated from individuals subsequently identified to be infected with HIV, and the design of the study. It was a retrospective study of previous donations from individuals subsequently identified as infected with HIV, investigation of donations from individuals believed to have transmitted HIV infection by transfusion, investigation of donations transfused to recipients later found to be infected with HIV, in whom the only identified risk for infection was blood transfusion. Then if we go down to the results, 5 HIV-infected recipients were identified who'd not previously been known to be infected. In addition, the RTC became aware of 2 recipients known to be anti-HIV positive but previously unreported. All infected recipients were transfused before 1985 with unscreened blood or components. Of the possible transfusion-transmitted HIV infections, 1/3 were considered not due to transfusion, 1/3 thought likely without the identification of a culprit donor, and 5 donors were identified as likely to have been responsible for 6 reported cases. 1 case could not be investigated through lack of records, and 1 is still under investigation. What we note in the conclusions are that investigations failed to reveal any infection arising after screening of blood donations commenced in 1985 in this study. Overall, 42% of identifiable recipients died within 6 months of transfusion. 8 of 32 living recipients were infected with HIV, and 5 of these were newly detected through the investigation. Laboratory record keeping was generally deficient prior to 1985. Accurate recording of transfusion details in patient medical records remains a conspicuous problem up to the date of the report. The investigation confirms the exceedingly small chance of transmission of HIV by transfusion of screened blood and blood components. So again, something that was highlighted in relation to early jaundice inquiries, the difficulties in relation to both laboratory record keeping and patient medical records, and the challenges that gives rise to in a look-back process. It's perhaps instructive to go into the detail of this study in relation to one element, and that's internal page 11. Under the heading Discussion. The investigation of possible transfusion-transmitted infection is extremely laborious and time-consuming. Investigation must be both thorough and methodical. This involves work for the RTC, hospitals, general practitioners and FHSAs. Meticulous checking of records at the RTC and hospital laboratory is necessary to ensure that the relevant donation is traced to the correct recipients and recorded in the patient's medical notes. It's not uncommon to find that a hospital laboratory has records of issuing a donation for a particular recipient, but the medical notes contain no information about the donations transfused. Such an omission obviously leaves room for doubt when investigating possible cases of transfusion-transmitted infection. Hospital laboratory record keeping has generally much improved since the health circular relating to record keeping and stock control. On the other hand, audits of blood transfusion practice continue to show gross deficits in the recording of information in medical notes. The majority of cases of transfusion-transmitted HIV infection arise from blood transfusions given in 1982 to 1984. As record keeping was not satisfactory at that time and usually related to non-computerized systems, it can often be difficult and time-consuming to retrieve information within the RTC, in the hospital laboratory, and in the medical records department. Furthermore, recipients can be difficult to trace if no longer under hospital care. In many instances, recipients have moved home and are no longer registered with the general practitioner caring for them at the time of transfusion. As contact is made first through a doctor, a significant amount of time is spent in correspondence with FHSAs to trace the appropriate GP. Sometimes the RTC has written to 5 or 6 doctors in an individual case, haematologist, surgeon, physician, referring physician, GP, without any of them wishing to take responsibility for notifying the recipient. Not only does this cause extra work, but it considerably delays the investigation. On occasion, several reminder letters have been necessary before the RTC has been supplied with relevant information. The period between initiation and completion of an investigation can be as long as 1 year. The more distant the transfusion, the longer the investigation will take. And if we go to the next paragraph and just pick it up halfway through, it's of continuing concern to the BTS that there's no mechanism for checking whether a lapsed donor has subsequently been reported as HIV positive through the confidential reporting system operated by the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre. The failure of professionals to ask individuals diagnosed as infected with HIV about prior blood donation and then to notify the RTC also leads to missed opportunities to identify all recipients infected with HIV by transfusion. So that was the discussion of Dr. Hewitt in the study, Dr. Hewitt in 1993. The final point I want to pick up in relation to the HTLV3 look back is the issue of donors who didn't subsequently return to give blood and the difficulties that appears to have raised and the documents in relation to that have been identified. If we could start with NHBT 2099107, please. It's a letter from the 9th of August 1991 from Dr. Hewitt to a consultant paediatrician. And if we pick up the 3rd paragraph, our usual practice in reports of possible transfusion-transmitted HIV infection is to institute a search for the records of the relevant donors. This we have done. As you'll know, routine screening of blood donations for evidence of HIV infection did not start until 1985. It was in September 1983 that the Department of Health issued advice about the exclusion of certain individuals from blood donation who might be at risk of HIV infection. It's likely that once we have traced the donors involved in X's case, we will find that a proportion have donated since 1985 and will therefore have been tested for anti-HIV. Our problem is what to do about the rest. It's possible that one or more of the donors ceased donating before 1985 in response to requests from the blood transfusion service to self-exclude from blood donation. In these cases, especially if we have no recent record of an address, attempts at contact with these ex-donors have been singularly successful. We will, however, examine our records and then determine what action is necessary.
Do you think it should mean unsuccessful?
Yes, I read it twice, sir, and wondered if what was being said was that it was singularly successful, as in it was only successful on the one occasion or occasional moments. It doesn't quite scan.
I mean, that's the context, isn't it?
It is. It is.
Otherwise, the context is to put un in front of successful.
Indeed.
It's the use of the word singularly.
The letter goes on, even if we decide to investigate no further, we strongly believe that all cases of possible transfusion-transmitted infection should be notified to the National Blood Transfusion Service so that we may at least document the case. Two final documents on this point. NHBT 201, apologies, just give me one moment, sir. Yes. Only one further document. DHSC 20149778 _ 092. A letter from a clinical director of the South Thames Blood Transfusion Service to Dr. Edgman in relation to a particular case. I fear that we're not going to satisfactorily resolve this case. Of the 23 donors implicated, there are 11 who are lost to follow-up. Attempts were made to contact these donors in 1986, but they failed to attend for further sampling when requested and have not donated subsequently. As it happens, a significant number were from a local college and had moved on. So a further example of the difficulty if donors didn't re-attend. And so I will go to the final document. NHBT 2015135 _ 002, please. And it's a letter from August 1998 from Dr. Gorman to Dr. McGovern, dealing with an application by a patient to the financial assistance schemes and trying to track whether they trace the transfusions that they had received. Because, as you'll appreciate, Ms. X has received a very large number of transfusions, we've confined ourselves to identifying donors from two groups of donations, and they're then set out. And then we go to the last paragraph of the letter, where Dr. Gorman says, however, I feel that it's unlikely that all of Mrs. X's donors will either be contactable now or will have donated again since the index donation. This is not for any sinister reasons, but simply because a significant percentage of donors cease to donate every year. And therefore, she suggests it should be going to the adjudication board in relation to the financial assistance scheme. So again, a recognition from another consultant haematologist, Dr. Gorman, that even without the self-exclusion of donors, there's a significant proportion of donors who simply don't return on a regular basis. So that brings me to an end of the presentation on HTLV3. Look back both in terms of its process and some of the difficulties that were identified by those undertaking it. There is, of course, a full written presentation with a large number of other references and other examples of the things I've highlighted today on relativity for core participants, and I understand it will be on the website, the inquiry website, at a later point.
Yes, well, thank you very much. So that's the end of your presentation today.
That's the end of the presentations for today, sir.
Tomorrow?
There will be a presentation tomorrow in relation to Professor Cash.
Yes. So that's a 10 o'clock start, Professor Cash tomorrow.